AP Key Concept 5.2 is all about imperialism and the nation-state formation that happens from that. It's actually connected very much to ideas of the Enlightenment and nationalism, which are mentioned in Key Concept 5.3, but that started in Europe. This is kind of the impact of those by European nations as they conquer other countries, but then as those countries take on some of those ideals. AP identifies three things. They basically look at the industrializing powers. How does industrialism in Europe and then as it spreads to America, Japan, Russia, how does that cause transoceanic empires? And then how does that affect state formation and state contraction, the end of states, which I'm going to connect as well to nationalism? And then what are the motivations that justify this in social Darwinism? We're going to look first at who are the powers in particular, and then the justifications, and then we'll go back to how this influences other nation states. So as we look at what imperialism is, basically it's just a system of ruling involving making an empire. During this time, it means making an empire that usually extends to lands beyond your next door neighbor. In fact, the European nations are imperializing not one another. They're not creating empires out of their neighbors. They're creating them by going to other parts of the world and taking those over. Just to put this in context, we need to understand how it connects and how it differs from what we might call old imperialism or the age of exploration, colonialism, which was more marked in the 1400s, the 1700s. Well, first off, that's the major difference. The new imperialism is in the 1800s. It is inspired by capitalism, not mercantilism. It's inspired by creating direct control over areas and controlling those resources. Even when technically they're indirect control, it's still for the purpose of telling and directing the actions that go on in that country. Furthermore, at this time, we've seen a lot of revolutions in the Americas. So much of America is not involved in the imperialism struggle, except as imperial powers. We are going to see the United States come in, which previously in old imperialism had been imperialized, colonized. Now they are part of the imperialism wave. Similarly, Japan, which we'll connect to later. And then the motivations are different, but also similar. You'll see some connections. Old imperialism, much more focused on kind of the gold god glory of the past, almost seeking to be Roman in that sense. Gold coming out of a desire for mercantilism. The religious motivation coming out of the Protestant Reformation, which encourages Catholics to leave. Now we see a more Protestant focus on spreading of religion and missionaries, but also a more capitalistic focus on resources so they can build their factories, more nationalistic rivalry between European countries, and then racism inspired by new theories. Look at that momentarily. Let's just compare as well in terms of who's imperializing where. If you notice in old imperialism, the main imperial powers are actually Spanish and Portuguese first. You see some Dutch in the Southeast Asian area, and then you see some French in the Americas. That's about it. By the time you get to new imperialism, there are multiple new imperial powers, and there are some that have kind of faded off the scene. Portugal and Spain, not really to be found. They are still countries. They are still trying to engage in imperialism, but you see them much less. Very small borderlands, as you can kind of see in the African areas. But for the most part, Asia and Africa are now dominated by new powers. The country of Germany has just been formed. They are creating their empire. You see France growing around the world. You see Netherlands, though, staying still under Dutch control. So there are some continuities as well as some differences. And then, of course, America being dominated by the United States during this time rather than any other country. So this is where we get to that third point that AP mentions, the motives. Why does imperialism even happen? Well, resources are a big one. Industrial Revolution, they're now creating factories. They're trying to establish new materials in order to expand their economies. They need resources. They also need new places to sell the goods they're making. And so you have kind of that push for both markets and raw materials in the form of resources. There's also rivalries. And I use this word to refer more to the European countries and their antagonism towards one another. They really did believe that if they had the most colonies, they were the best. And so there's this push to get more and more land to prove that they're better than their other European imperializing countries. This, of course, would prove additionally useful in creating more empires and getting more land and being more powerful than any other country in Europe. But then there's also this more ideological component. Now, the major one that is new in this time period is the racism coming out of a scientific lens. Darwin has published his book, Origin of Species, and from that idea, you get the idea of social Darwinism. Darwin did not support that idea. Herbert Spencer takes Darwin's idea and applies it to society, applies it to people. And basically his argument is that the fittest people will survive. There are some fitter people, there are some more highly evolved humans, and this is where he comes up with the system of race. This goes along with other comments during the time of phrenology and eugenics, which are looking at either the structure of people or the genetics within people to define this characteristic as good, this characteristic is not good. Hopefully it's obvious. This comes to racism pretty quickly. And while racism isn't always a motivation for making people go out and imperialize, it certainly justified their presumption to go and take over other people. Well, we're better than them, we're fitter than them, we wouldn't be able to take them over if we weren't more highly evolved. But then you have, so that's almost a darker aspect, but then you also have a religious aspect, which leads to some of the same ends at times, and yet also works in counter purposes at times. It depends on who is spreading the religion, but certainly a missionary endeavor on the part of some Protestants, more than Catholics during this time, and then also a more just humanitarian approach to civilizing. So you see, again, kind of under this general head of religion or humanitarian work, this idea that, well, we can make other places better if we either share our religion or we share our culture. Sometimes that went together, sometimes they were separate, but both of them, this goal of improving other people's lives. So racism, we're better than them. Religion or humanitarian, still sometimes that assumption that we have more truth or we have a better culture, but a more positive approach to trying to help those people. I should note, too, that some missionaries actually went against other imperialists, so you certainly don't have a totally full anti- or pro-imperial religious back to this. How did things imperialize? Well, pretty basically, you got two different ways. Indirect rule was the British way. Direct rule was the way of most other European powers. Indirect rule was the attempt to maintain power by not kicking out the existing leaders. Use the local rulers to support your government, almost like a puppet leadership. Direct rule is if you kick them out and you send someone from your country to be king or leader of that region. So indirect versus direct. And this kind of goes into a typical four-step pattern, being the last two being one step as kind of two parts. Europe usually enters. Usually it enters economically. Then there's usually local resistance, followed by Europe strengthening their force, sometimes causing direct rule, sometimes just causing stronger indirect rule. And then the people in the country that are being imperialized kind of have two options. They can either westernize or they can nationalize. And sometimes those things can overlap. But the westernize is kind of a join them to beat them, and a nationalize is we're going down with a fight. So those approaches of either celebrating their culture, changing their culture, and embracing the changes to their culture are part of those responses. Really quickly, for example, you see this in India. British East India Company enter. This was actually an old imperialism. Britain is continuing during this time. British East India Company comes in. The Indian Rebellion is sparked by sepoys that believe that their religious convictions have been violated by new cartridges smeared in pig and beef grease. They revolt. This leads to a very bloody Indian Rebellion of 1857, the end of which causes Queen Victoria to send her army and become an actual British colony where she is Empress of India. She takes out the British East India Company and destroys the Mughal Empire and establishes British direct rule in India. This is one of the few exceptions, actually, that in South Africa somewhere, where you see direct rule by the British. In India, two responses. Many Indians do embrace the westernization. You see a lot of increased schools, infrastructure, the Western dress as they take on some of these approaches. But then you also see a celebration of Indian culture in new ways, a revival of literature at this time, which is more marked by Indian and Hindu traditions. And then even resistances, which are going to come later in the 1900s, including the man Gandhi, who I will hear more about in period 6. Similarly, in China, British East India comes in. Then you have two responses. You've got the Opium Wars that are against the West by the Qing government, and then the anti-Qing government, who are also foreigners. If you remember, the Qing are actually Manchu. So an anti-Qing rebellion in the form of the Taiping. That's followed by a treaty which only strengthens the influence of European powers over China, and then followed by, speeding forward, two responses. Self-strengthening, let's become more industrial, or nationalism, let's kick them out. So again, this pattern applies to multiple different countries. Hopefully you can see that in those two examples.